it's not about how I want it to end. It really is about staying true to that character.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yanis Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this show, we democratize the film criticism conversation by talking to fans and critics alike about a film that either they grew up with or something that they really emotionally resonate with, something that they connect with on a personal level. So this week, I'm joined by Angela Betancourt. Angela, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So why don't you tell listeners a little bit about who you are and what you have going on?
Sure. So I work in communications and marketing, and I love working on communication strategies for small businesses. And I'm also really big on pop culture. I love film. I love anything that involves the creative arts. And I see movies particularly as a form of escape, but also great topics of discussion for themes of our lives, and I'm just really excited to be here.
Yeah, I've worked in marketing communications in a corporate environment before, and I don't know, I think there's something about, maybe because we're so focused on what our message is and what we're trying to get across in whatever project we're working on, that I feel like people in that line of work tend to be more generally disposed to creativity and entertainment, getting more out of it than just escapism, kind of more of a cultural enrichment, whether that's like you're really big into music or reading, or in this case film. So I 100% understand where you're coming from. I feel like I've tended to lean more populist in my thoughts on movies these days. But I really love when a film can start a conversation afterwards, and I think that the one we're going to talk about today definitely qualifies.
Exactly, especially when I want the main character to do something other than what that character is doing. Mm-hmm. It really evokes a sense of intrigue in me, but also sometimes frustration, and it gives me a moment to kind of reflect on what I would really do in that situation. And it's just movies that really give you a new perspective on things. I find them to be just so enriching, as you mentioned, and also because I really feel that as a storyteller myself, and working in communications and telling all of these different stories, and especially from that perspective of public relations and media relations, that I'm always looking for great stories. I always want to be inspired, and movies that awaken that in me, I think, are always films that I consider great.
Do you hear all the time about different people saying like, oh, they don't make good movies like they used to anymore or anything like that. Do you think there's any truth to that, or do you feel that it's maybe the films that aren't not necessarily top of the box office, you just have to dig a little deeper for those gems?
I think that great movies are still being made, and I think that a lot of these films don't always get the attention that they deserve. Right? We always see the big blockbuster films, and they have tons of trailers, and people are talking about it actively on social media, and the marketing team of these films are doing phenomenal jobs of being everywhere. But then there's so many independent filmmakers out there that are really doing incredible things, and I've seen that going into film festivals. I love going to film festivals in different cities because that's where you get to see beautiful films on a variety of topics and genres that you wouldn't otherwise get exposed to by just watching trailers on YouTube or in the theater. And I really believe that phenomenal movies are still being made in every genre, actually.
Yeah, and it's, I think, to your point about film festivals, I think you get more of that raw talent, that vision, and hasn't been, it hasn't gone through a million boardrooms of people saying like, well, can you tone this down or play this up and things like that. And, on the previous episode of the podcast, I talked about Star Wars because I'm big into Star Wars, but that's Disney. It pretty much owns 40%, I think, of the market share these days. And they make good movies sometimes, but it's also, that's like the pinnacle of this kind of corporate filmmaking that, those Marvel movies are fun, but they all kind of tick the similar boxes, and very rarely do they step outside of them.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of those movies also have that historical context, right? Mm-hmm. Characters that we grew up with, characters that were around before we were born, characters that have these storylines that have been around for 30, 40, 50 years that keep getting reinvented. And so there's a lot that I think these films can lean on in the terms of you're presenting a movie that a lot of different generations have already been exposed to, and now they come into it thinking, this is great, let's see what interesting spin they've put on it this time. Or I think about the evolution of Batman, right? Who I think is one of the largest character evolutions in terms of kind of these campy TV show personas and to this Dark Knight vibe. And I think it's great in that way. But at the same time, a lot of films that don't have that, it's the first time that they're introducing a character or telling a story that's never been told. They don't really have that historical context to lean on. And I think that in many ways, those films don't get the same kind of exposure that these other films do, just because of the nature of the film, right? Even if they come up with a film that's not great, you can still say, well, compared to the film from 5 years ago, XYZ. So I think great movies are still being made, and that's why I'm such a big fan of film festivals. And because there's so many things out there, I think that stories that are being told that I think a lot of audiences have never been exposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. And the film we're actually going to talk about, I think, came out probably a limited theatrical release. It made, I think, a total of about $9 million at the U.S. or North American box office. And it struck me watching it today that how easily this could have just been staged as a play, that it's usually 2 or 3 people in a room having a conversation, and we'll get more into that in a minute. But you contrast this to movies that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's all CG background, green screen, and things like that. And this is kind of a back to basics approach to filmmaking. And I think that that's unfortunately a harder film to find an audience these days. Everything's about franchises and everything. But I'm glad that you wanted to talk about it, because I think there's a meaty conversation to be had, or to be wrung out of the story of this film. So that being said, I guess let's listen to a little bit of the trailer for the film we're going to talk about in this episode, The Wife.
Don't paint me as a victim. I am much more interesting than that.
Don't walk away from me, damn it!
I can't do it anymore. I can't take it. I can't take the humiliation. What are we doing?
John, we're not bad people.
I think you are sick and tired of Joe Castleman.
I would like to convey to you the warm congratulations of the Swedish Academy. You have reinvented the very nature of storytelling.
Tell me about yourself. Do you have an occupation?
I do.
And what is that?
I am a kingmaker.
That was a little bit of the trailer for The Wife, directed by Björn Runge. I think I'm pronouncing that name correctly. I probably am not. But he is a Swedish filmmaker, and he actually has a pretty lengthy filmography before this. So, of course, starring Glenn Close, Jonathan Pryce, Christian Slater, and a few others, which I'm sure we'll get to. And this film very nearly got Glenn Close the Academy Award. I think everybody was really expecting that to happen. Do you follow the Oscars at all, or were you really watching that night to see if she was going to win?
I do follow the Oscars, and I'm not always. What happens to me a lot of times is the Oscar shows up, and then I realize I'm still missing 6 of the films or whatever that have been nominated, and I'm in a mad rush to catch up to it after the fact. But I was aware of her nomination in this. I don't believe she's won an Academy Award yet.
No, which is crazy.
Which is ridiculously crazy, and she is just brilliant, absolutely brilliant in this film, but just in general. And I was watching to see if this was, that night was going to be her night. I think a lot of people were watching closely to see. It's way overdue, I think, for her.
Yeah, I think everybody thinks that as well, especially when she won the Golden Globe for this performance, and she gave such a great speech. And a lot of times, that helps to kind of boost their profile or their chances of getting votes and stuff, because she made a huge impression that night as well. So just to delve into briefly what the film is about. So Glenn Close plays Joan Castleman, wife to this acclaimed author who's on the verge of getting awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And then it really just kind of a dissection or deconstruction of their relationship and the family dynamic throughout the course of the film. So before we get into the heavy review segment, why did you pick this film? When did you first see it? What's the story behind that?
I watched this film on a flight. I travel quite a bit, and I catch up on my movies on planes. And Oscar season arrived this year, and I realized, okay, once again, I haven't seen a lot of these films. And so I made a very intentional effort to make sure that I watch these films, and plane rides are great times to do that. And so I watched this movie on a flight, and I thought, okay, there were a few others that called my attention that I hadn't seen, but some of those were just, I wasn't in the mood for that. I wasn't more in the mood for something with Glenn Close in it, to be honest. And I thought, okay, let's watch this film. And it was interesting the way that it was written and it was shot. It's based on the book by Meg Wolitzer, and I think it was a really good adaptation of that. And the way that the movie builds up, and the way that there is, you really don't know what's going to happen in many senses, and when she's going to feel that moment to finally express her truth, if you will. Mm-hmm. There really isn't a pivotal point of when that's exactly going to happen for me. And what I loved about this film was that element of, I'm not really sure how this is going to end. What is she really going to do up to the very end of the film? And I loved the fact that I loved her character as a woman. She really, to me, was such a full character of what it is to be a wife and a mother and a woman. And so much of that, I thought, was brilliantly done. And her decisions and her elegance and grace throughout the whole film, and incredible patience, were all things that really appealed to me about this film that I loved. I don't know if she was if the Oscar nominations had come out before I saw this, but I knew that she was in the conversation, probably a likely Oscar winner, or close. I know it was, pun intended, close between her and Lady Gaga and Olivia Colman, who ended up winning. I know that was those were the three circling the lead of the Best Actress category. So I saw it knowing that she was on that trajectory. And for I'd say probably the first half of the movie, I'm like, okay, she's doing really, good understated work. And then as it goes on, it's this slow unraveling of her character, which we'll get into. I was totally floored by it by the end. And I knew basically nothing about it going in, except that it starred Glenn Close, and it was, kind of a tour de force performance for her. And that was basically and I love going into movies like that. That so rarely happens these days, where you walk into a film and you're like, all right, it's called this. I don't really 100% know the genre. It stars this person, and this is the name of the movie, and that's it. And you just walk in without any idea of oh, this is the part from the trailer, or this is, you don't know, like you said, you don't know where it's going. And I think that really benefits a film like this, that it's all underneath the surface, and it takes pretty much the whole runtime. I mean, the movie is only 99 minutes long. I'd say it's at least over an hour into it before any kind of major revelation is really confirmed. Right, I agree with you, and I think that's part of the brilliance of this film is there's this constraint about her. I think it was done intentionally to show, they were married in the character, the two characters met when in university. I think it was 1954, if I'm not mistaken, and they have these flashbacks and to provide context. But throughout the film, in the current present moment of the film, there is this unraveling of her patience that is happening so slowly and so nuanced that I think as an actress takes incredible talent and incredible skill, because as the viewer, I'm sitting there thinking, I would have lost my cool about 45 minutes ago in this situation. Right. I just don't understand how her character is so graceful and patient, and with showing so much grace, even though at the same time you can see that pot is boiling beneath the surface, and it's gradually building. It's this, it doesn't reach full boiling point until later in the film, but it's this wonderful balance between her being, this good wife and the role that she plays as the supporter, as pretty much everything, as the person who remembers where everything is, glasses, medication, everything. And through all of this, her facial expressions, with very little words, you can see this buildup of impatience creeping in, and it's brilliant how she is able to do that. I think it really speaks to her generation in the film, where she started as kind of this character that's very, intrigued with this man and passionate about the situation, and really in for that experience, to, fast forward to where she is today and how she's maintained that same disposition until she hit, her boiling point. It's just beautifully done, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And, the flashbacks really, I think, lay the groundwork for that, really exploring not only the state that she's in, but how long she's been in that state and how long that pot has been boiling for decades. I couldn't. And it's, to a larger point, I mean, obviously the film gets into more specifics about this relationship, but to a larger point, like the movie really has a lot to say about a relationship and sort of the baggage that, like, in addition to whether, this particular situation, I feel like more broadly, the film is commenting on a marriage, a relationship, and how it accumulates this emotional baggage over time, and how bitterness builds, and how you kind of, a lot of times people become complacent in their relationship, whether or not something is right or wrong, and we'll get there. And I, being my wife and I just celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary. Thank you. Like last week, earlier this month or so. And so, coming to that to this movie from that perspective, and having seen it now a second time, knowing where it's headed, I was picking up on all those subtle cues, all those like little ways in which the camera kind of gently shifts over to Glenn Close's reaction, to Joan's reaction to everything going on with her husband, and hit all the praise that he's getting and all this other stuff, and breaking down that cliche of this the dutiful, supportive wife, really mining her emotional response to the role that she's sort of fallen into over the course of this marriage, and again with the flashbacks, learning how long she's been in this role and how long she's put up with everything that's been going on around her, before I'll getting into too specific. So that, from that perspective, really seeing the movie 2 times, I think it's a movie that rewards repeat viewings for that reason, for the details in Glenn Close's performance, but also coming to it from someone who's been married a few years. You're like, oh man, we got to really let's not let something like this happen where we're growing apart over the next few decades. I think it makes it a little personal for me, at least. Yeah, I am not a married person, and from my perspective, I really think about, well, what is. And I spoke to my married friends about this film. What is
really marriage and this commitment you make to the other person, right? And standing beside them and supporting them. And, you know, as she so famously says in the film, which I think is my favorite line in the film, and then, of course, the response to that was very telling as well, was when during this dinner, and I don't know in terms of spoiling stuff, but my favorite line in the film was, and I think it is actually in one of the previews as well, is when at this dinner they ask her, you know, a diplomat or somebody of very high caliber turns to her and says, you know, and what do you do? And she says, I'm a kingmaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wrote that down too.
And he says, oh, my wife would say the same. And I thought, that's fascinating to me. And to what extent is that, how does that play out, I think, in real marriages today? And what does it mean to really stand by someone to that degree? And it was just wonderful for me to see that, because what would someone else do in that same situation? How long, for decades, would they keep this facade, this lie? And so it just gave me a lot to think about. And it's a conversation I love talking about with married people, because as a non-married person, I feel, what does, you know, when I get married someday, or if I get married someday, what does that look like for me? What would I do? And it's really interesting to think about that and to talk about that. And as you mentioned, you know, being a married person, not learning from those lessons and not letting something like that happen in your own marriage, I think is also very fascinating.
Yeah, the film definitely has a very specific perspective on marriage and relationships in general. And I think there's also an element of it that, in a way, the film has to be set when it's set. I mean, even the present day part of it is set in 1992, it says at the beginning, which I'd forgotten about. So that they could really focus on the relationship kind of developing in the late 50s, early 60s, because part of it is obviously a generational thing. Like, I don't think post the feminist movement and all that, like, modern women, I don't think would stand for this kind of shit as much as Joan does, because it's also like part of the times. And, you know, she's I guess we should we're basically leading right into the review of this segment, so we should just start that now.
Okay.
And then we don't have to dance around things anymore. But she's told very early on, we see in their flashbacks, that when they get together, he's her professor, and she's an aspiring writer, and she's ultimately told, oh, you know, don't do this. You know, they're not going to take you seriously. The men in the publishing houses, even if they do, nobody's going to read it. And I thought that moment felt very true to that era.
Agreed.
And I don't know, I felt very conflicted about it, because even though it felt like that's something that someone would say at that time, I mean, someone points out sometime in the film, I forget who it is exactly, but someone mentions to her, like, oh, there's a lot of authors, female authors, you know, nowadays, or things like that. So it's like, it's a question of the market not necessarily being ready for female authors. And you have that scene where she's pouring coffee, and all the publishers and like they're reading manuscripts, and they're saying, oh, this one's from a lady writer. I couldn't relate to it, you know, that kind of thing, and how they basically brush that off. There's that element to it, but then there's the other element that she has some insecurity within her, probably perpetuated by her significant other at the time. I mean, I know it's perpetuated by him, that she doesn't really want to put herself through that. Like, she's not willing to face the likely rejection that she's going to get from the literary community.
I agree with you. And I agree that in terms of, absolutely, it's a generational thing. And when I think about that, and the point you just made in terms of the rejection, she was not put in a position of success from the very beginning, right? It shows that she's not going to be taken seriously as a female writer. And I think that really ate away at her. And then she falls in love with this, you know, professor person, and there's an opportunity for her to at least then express her writing through him, because as they made very clear in the film, no one, you know, quote unquote, is going to read something by a woman. It's going to end up on the bookshelf based on what there was interaction with that other woman who did author things. And she said it's just sitting in a shelf somewhere. No one's reading it. And So from the beginning, I think she was kept down or disillusioned. Then she finds an opportunity to express her voice, find her voice, and have people read her stuff, even though she's not getting the credit for it. And so I can understand to some extent her finding, sticking through that whole process, right? The 8 hours a day sitting locked up in a room. But I think what bothered me about the situation is Joe's character and his philandering, right? I think, when I think about their whole relationship, when they first meet, I think she is in some ways eager to and excited about this process in some ways, or willing to put up with this process because people are reading her things. But I just don't like that the way he's treating her throughout this whole process makes it difficult for me to understand why she would continue in this marriage.
She reads his novel and gives her honest feedback, which he asked for. And then he flips out and basically like, oh, this relationship is doomed. It's over between us. And he's basically kind of entraps her in a way that early in the relationship, like giving her I guess, she's supposed to be a teenager, early 20s. And he's a decade at least older and cheated on his previous wife with her in the first place. And, he just can't deal with any kind of criticism. And it's just like this. I even said to my wife, we were watching it earlier today, I'm like, this is basically white male privilege, the movie, because he's just can't handle it. And he's just like, no, I need to be told that what I'm doing is perfect. Otherwise, then there must be something wrong with you or all of that. And that's the starting point for their relationship.
I didn't even think about the whole white male privilege perspective. I completely agree with you now that you've mentioned it. Yes, there's certainly elements of that. And again, I think that's also very, the 50s, the boys club, the white male thing going on and getting away with things. And I looked at him as he's just always been this man without a backbone. He's a child. They had 3 children, I believe, right? In the marriage. And he was the real child all along.
Well, and you find out through the course of Joan interacting with the Nathaniel Bone character played by Christian Slater, who's looking to write a biography about Joe. You find out that he doesn't even talk to his ex-wife or his daughter from the previous marriage. Like he's basically like just moved on, and because they're not they're kind of embarrassed by that part of their life and the way that their Joe and Joan's marriage started. And even the whole film, he's just going around. Like, I feel like Jonathan Pryce is eating in every single scene of this movie. And they're always telling him, you're stuffing your face with animal fat. You're like, you have a heart situation. And there's reference to early on when he's making a speech, he says, oh, a few bypasses later, I'm still here. So clearly he's had health issues that he's just like, whatever, it's fine. She'll take care of me. She's just like leaning on him, or he's leaning on her so much that he's just, as you said, he's a child. He's just throwing caution to the wind. Like, oh, my wife will clean up my mess. It's like over the course of the movie to learn that he's been taking credit for what she's been doing all this time for decades, and then to watch her in Stockholm going through this whole process, and then the lady part of the team that's taking care of them is like, oh, we can arrange some shopping for you or a beauty thing, and I'm like, Jesus, it's very frustrating to watch this movie knowing where it's going and having watched it the second time.
There's so much that condensation. There's just so much putting her down in so many of the scenes. People just, and really, she's the genius behind, and that's what makes, for me, her performance so incredible, is that she kept this composure while at the same time you can just see that she's starting to just get enraged inside. And I thought that, especially as it builds up towards the end, and to bring in Christian Slater into the movie, because I thought he was also really great in his role. And I love the scene where it's getting a little bit flirtatious between the two of them, because it's just interesting to see that other side of her. And yet, even with the flirtation, she still keeps her cool. She never loses it at all, really, except there's that one scene. But in terms of with other people or in public, she just doesn't she doesn't, she's like poker face. And I just think it's amazing.
Yeah. And you see the cracks kind of forming intermittently throughout the film, but of course, before it's revealed what's going on, you don't really understand why. She's like the way the camera actually focuses more on her reaction than his when they get the phone call confirming that they're giving him the Nobel, and then they're jumping up on the bed, which is again referenced later when they jump up when they're getting published, and you see them later with young Joe and Joan jumping up. We're getting published. And here it's like him going, I won the Nobel, and she's just jumping up, and then when he says that, it like shakes her up, and she's like taken back because of the weight of knowing that it's really her, and she's not getting the credit for it, and like all of that, I thought was really subtly done.
Oh, I agree. I think the directing in this film was spectacular, and the angles. There's that one scene where it's the middle of the night, and he's sitting in that big space. I just love that cinematography of that moment, because here's a singular person who's been very much, everything's really been about him this entire time, and the symbolism of this big space around him, empty space around him, I thought was also very powerful.
Yeah, that's the scene in the middle of the night where he's again eating, and he almost basically hooks up with the photographer.
Yes.
Yeah. He hasn't changed his behavior. He's not looking to. He's just no interest in anything. The most that we get from him, just to shift over to Joe for a second, for which we should also mention, Jonathan Pryce is really great in this film too. A lot of it is kind of a two-hander with the two of them playing off of each other. You get a lot of guilt on his side, and that's probably part of why he's cheating on her. He's blaming it on the thing that's going on with her, and that he feels bad about it, so that he's like a self-destructive thing. And he references throughout, like, oh, without this woman, I'm nothing, and like I'd like to thank my wife. And in his speech, that's the other thing too that I wanted to make sure I mentioned. And he does. She asks. She's been putting up with this behavior from him for decades, right? So right. She says, just please, one thing I ask of you, please do not thank me in your speech. I don't want to look like the long-suffering wife, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And his concern is not, oh, I have to thank you. You wrote these things. His concern is, but it'll make me look like an asshole if I don't. Like everything, he's so focused on his image and what other people are going to think, not the way he's treating his wife or his son and things like that. And that, I think that really, it ends up being kind of his defining characteristic.
I agree. It's really about him. He's self-centered. His whole life has been about how he looks, how he's perceived,
and her whole life too. That's the thing.
Exactly. But I think coming and I agree with you. Just to backtrack for a second, that sure. Jonathan Pryce is brilliant in this. I've seen him in things previously, but it wasn't really until Game of Thrones that I really kind of immersed myself in who he is as an actor because of the High Sparrow, and I couldn't help but notice what to me felt like a couple of elements of his character in Game of Thrones poking through a little bit in this character, and maybe that's just my imagination because I'm such a Game of Thrones fan, but I did see in both scenarios they're just not the good characters, they're not the good guys, and I just thought that was really interesting. But yeah, he's, this character in this film is it's all about him. He doesn't care how it comes across to anyone else, as long as he looks good and he is able to keep up this fake image that he's created for himself. And even at the cost of destroying not just his marriage, but the relationship with his son. Mm-hmm. That's such an interesting dynamic as well, is that, the children always know kind of vibe that something's wrong. And to grow up in that frame of mind of something is off here, can someone just please tell me what it is or what's really going on, because I know something is not right. And even knowing the damage that he's causing to his son, it doesn't matter. It's still about him and his world and this fake life he lives in.
And you get that heart-wrenching flashback where young David wants to go see his mom and show her something, and Joe's like, no, get out of there. Your mom's working. And she's like, Mom, I want to show you. And she's like basically entrapped. Actually, a movie I recently caught up with that I had never seen is Big Eyes, the Tim Burton movie from, 4 or 5 years ago. And that is it struck me how similar the themes are to that film in The Wife, because again, that's a movie about, I think it's also in the 60s, and she's a painter and he's a painter, presumably. But
I saw that.
Yeah, see, with Amy Adams and Christoph Waltz, and he's very good at the people stuff and schmoozing, and meanwhile she's the genius behind all the work that he's taking credit for. So this is very kind of a similar story, handled in a completely different way. But it struck me like that would be like a great double feature, The Big Eyes and The Wife, because they do focus on kind of a one-sided marriage, I guess, in a way, where she's giving her all to him, and he's just like, cool, thanks, I'll enjoy that. I'll put it in my back pocket and make me look good. And it also, it's funny, it makes me think of the movie Mother from 2017 that I recently talked on this podcast about. Yep. Because that is another one where she's like literally giving everything she has to feed his creative process. At least in that one, he's doing his own writing, but still, it's focusing on the suffering of the woman for the betterment of the man, basically. Exactly.
Yeah, and I agree, because those films, I do see elements of that kind of perspective and that same theme. Absolutely showing up. It's similar to this film as well. These women that are the geniuses behind the man and don't get the credit, or have their ideas stolen, or are completely taken advantage of. As a woman watching the film, it's infuriating, right? Because I want to see them just waiting for her to just finally put it all out there. And the fact that Joe never saw, I think he said, he never realized how she felt, was just so telling of how detached and just clueless and non-observational he is. And so I was watching this film getting increasingly frustrated, just thinking, when is the injustice going to stop?
Right.
And until even at the very, very end, I was surprised still.
So I wanted to focus for a second on David's sort of subplot. So he has a short story that he's written, and he just really wants his dad's approval and kind of blessing on it, or feedback, I guess, at least. And it's telling very early on that Joan tells David what she thought is beautifully written, and he's like, yeah, okay, what is Dad? Did Dad read it? And that's kind of planting the seed for the way that the rest of that storyline is going to go. And David really ends up being Nathaniel Bone meets up with him later on, and he's sort of the catalyst for things really spiraling out of control in the third act. So what did you think about David's subplot? And that's actually played by Max Irons, son of Jeremy Irons, which I keep forgetting that's the case.
Right, exactly, yes.
And also Annie, I wanted to mention too, because I just realized this again, that young Joan was played by Annie Stark, who's the real life daughter of Glenn Close. So she's playing a young version of her mom in this film, which I thought was interesting.
I love that. And it's such an interesting detail, isn't it? I love that subplot. I think I can actually, on a personal level, and not to get into too much, because that's a different podcast, but I can certainly understand this wanting to get approval from your father. I have personal experience with that. And so I understand how important it is to just get a little bit of that validation. If I understand not caring what anyone else thinks, but there's always that one person whose opinion does matter. And, to see him so desperately want to just get some words of comfort, affirmation, validation from his father, just saying, son, I took some time out of my day I prioritized you. I can relate to, what you wrote, and I think you're on the right track. Just to hear that from somebody who is this figure, right? Not just your father, but it happens to be that your father is this storied writer. To want that, I felt for him. I can relate to that on a very deep and personal level. And my heart was broken for him, especially because of the irony of the fact that all along, the person who actually did give you that validation, the person who did read your work, the person who did think it was great, was actually the person whose opinion really did matter in the end.
And Joe is just very dismissive of his son, like throughout. Like he's just, we'll talk about it later. Or, he's introduces his son, and his son is, still waking up from the travel. And he kind of uses the son as the butt of his joke to get laughs out of people around him to make himself look good. And as you said, he turns out that he was, as he says at one point, worshiping at the wrong parental shrine.
That's right, exactly.
Which is a great line.
Such a great line, yeah.
And just so much of his, and then I think trying to get the approval of your parents, I think, is something that pretty much everybody can relate to on some level or another. And she even says at one point to Joe, it's not easy being your son. His approval doesn't mean anything coming from me. Everyone needs approval, which is sort of also, I think, in a way, kind of her being like, there's a talking about herself, because there's a lot of lines of dialogue and things in here that felt very meta to me. Like there's at one point when Joe finally does talk to David about his story, he compliments it, but then he says, I don't know if I really buy into the couple. It feels like a cliche, the blowhard husband and the stoic wife with repressed rage. I'm like, geez, that sounds like the movie we're watching right now. There's a lot of that kind of thing about just demonstrating Joe's lack of self-awareness and the lack of the fact that he's been leeching off of his wife, and it's extended to his kids. As David says at one point, "You made a slave of my mother," he says to her, which I was like, I got to write that down, because that's a really powerful line, and it is essentially on some level what he's been doing.
Again, it really speaks to, and I have to bring it back a little bit to, Christian Slater's character, because he was a bit of a catalyst in helping to bring some of these emotions to the surface, I think. Mm-hmm. I think he was really important in helping these characters, not so much Joe, really, because I think Joe is just really stuck in his head in many ways, but I think that he helped kind of give David a little bit of the ammunition to confront, right? To really kind of, he set a little bit more of a fire underneath him. It's important to point that out in the film. But yeah, I think David's character is, I think, really important. It is kind of the side thing, but I think it really is important in terms of looking at how the children play a role in I guess the children are the common denominator in some ways, and we see that when the grandchild is born, right? When the grandchild is born, suddenly there's this, they're instantly connected again, these two characters. And so I really do see the importance of the children and the grandchildren playing in how this marriage also stays together in many ways.
I thought that was a great moment too, because you see how quickly their dynamic, the mood switches. They're like screaming at each other, and then lost in sort of this very joyful moment of their grandchild being born. And to that point, I think that the point of the film is a question of legacy, like Joe's legacy, Joan's legacy, and that carries on, of course, to their kids and their grandchild. That's why I think it feels like a very random aside thing for their grandchild to be born, but it does underscore that theme, I think, in a lot of ways. Agreed, absolutely. And what I really liked about Glenn Close's performance here is that she does get a chance to, in a lot of ways, it feels like the ultimate Glenn Close performance, because she gets to be restrained. She gets to kind of seethe and rage. She gets to be kind of grief-stricken. She gets to try tears of joy. She gets to blow up at him and have these like very Oscar Clippy moments where she's screaming at him about how she just can't do it anymore, and how he goes around saying that his wife doesn't write. And that moment that she screams at him, and I got like chills on the back of my neck when she does, because it's so powerful. And then he asks her, well, if I'm such an asshole, why did you marry me? And she's like, I don't know.
I think that was a very powerful scene as well. I mean, that conversation, he actually couldn't handle it, right? So he literally couldn't handle that when she finally does put everything out there, right. which is also just his fragility. You know, at first I thought, oh my gosh, what's happening at that moment? But then I had a moment of relief. But then, so I'm actually still working through all the different things I felt at that moment. But her whole entire, you know, what's beautiful about Glenn Close, I think, is when you give her an opportunity to show a million ranges of emotion, she does it so well, mm-hmm. right? From this kind of elegant grace of restraint to losing her patience, to finally blowing up, to showing joy about, you know, this new life that's just come into the world, to anger, to you see this full range of emotion in a film. That's always beautiful to see. I love to see characters that are developed, right? You can see just every range of emotion, because women, and also, you know, going back to to that moment with Christian Slater, his character in the restaurant, is, you know, you can see that sassy side of her too, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, okay, don't mess with me, honey. Like, you know, you're like young enough to be my son. Like, but whatever, you know, I can hang. I love that. I just love seeing her in that moment. And it was just so wonderful to see a character that is all of these things, you know, woman, sexy, smart, elegant, restrained, subdued, happy, angry, joyful. It's wonderful to see all of that, and to be able to do that, all of these things in such a short amount of time, right? Because the movie was not a very long film, and to still do it within the context of who this character is, again, just speaks volumes about the kind of actress that Glenn Close is.
Yeah, and especially for actors of this age, it's so rare that they get such complex roles as this. I mean, for both Close and Pryce, where, you know, they're usually if you see movies like with older people, they're very like, oh well, you know, just your grandparents or they're whatever. And in this movie, literally opens with they're an older couple, but they're in love. They have a healthy sex life. There's a sex scene, like basically at the very beginning of the movie.
I know, and it was awkward though. But it was a bit awkward.
It is a bit awkward, but I think that, you know, it delves. It's more realistic portrayal of people at this stage of their relationship, 30, 40 years into a marriage. You're going to have moments of spontaneity like that you did when you were young, but you're still going to be like, well, now you have decades of baggage going on here. And the fact that the film creates the perfect storm, where it's not only the Nobel Prize for literature, but also Nathaniel Bone kind of putting additional kind of heat to the situation that really causes her big turning point. I mean, she even says at one point, there's nothing more dangerous than a writer whose feelings have been hurt, talking about Nathaniel Bone, but could it just as easily apply to her at the end, where she finally realizes that she's got to leave him. She can't take it anymore. So I love the sort of parallels there as well.
Oh, I do. Exactly. I think that's it. You're right. You know, to see in this day and age, and that, you know, kind of going back to this conversation about our great films still being made. Absolutely. I think because you have these phenomenal actors that are, forget how old they are. They're still, you know, it's hard to say when has Glenn Close reached her peak, right? Like I don't think that's such a thing. I think she just is always good, like nonstop good. Yeah. Right? Like there's no up or down. Like she just is wonderful. And I feel the same way about Meryl Streep. I think everything she does is brilliant. And it doesn't matter how old she is. It's like, just put her in a film. It's going to make it better. Like when all else fails, throw Meryl Streep in there and everything will be all right. You know, these actors, their range, if anything, their age and wisdom and experience, and just adds even more to it, which is why I love seeing, actors like Morgan Freeman and Liam Neeson, these actors that are in their 60s and 70s, but they're just still, great, and get better with age, I would even say. And so, yeah, it's just I would love, and it's great to see films that put, these iconic actors and actresses next to up and coming actors and actresses. I love movies that do that as well, because I think you can see this generational talent, and to see Glenn Close in this performance, and also Jonathan Pryce and Christian Slater, Christian Slater has been acting for 1,000 years, right? He's also been around for a long time. So I was also really happy to see him in this kind of a role as well. So to see these actors do this film, and where there's no special effects, there's no green screens, there's no gimmicks or anything. It's just good acting, good script writing, beautifully shot movie with great backgrounds, because the film is also set, you see these kind of, beautiful hotel room settings, beautiful bar settings, beautiful ballroom settings. And I think that also makes the film just so wonderful.
Yeah, it's just gorgeous to look at, too, in addition to everything else that's going on screen. And, okay, so I think we need to kind of get to the climax of the film. So they're having their big argument, and he's somehow, I guess, over the years deluded himself into thinking that they're writing partners, even though he doesn't even know his own characters. He's been basically gaslighting his wife for decades. So in the midst of that, he, of course, has a heart attack. As I established, earlier we mentioned that he's gone through different surgeries and he's constantly eating, and so he has a heart attack, and she immediately snaps into supportive wife mode. She goes right back into, what can I do? Are you okay? That kind of thing. Because on some level, she does love him and everything, of course. As she says in that moment, I thought that was a really beautiful moment too, where she's like, even in that moment when he's having a heart attack and she's trying to care for him, he's again making it like, oh, do you love me? The kind of checking whether like, are we still cool after all this? and she, of course, being the character that she is, says, yes, I love you so much. And he's like, well, you're a terrible liar, and dies very abruptly. I
know. I thought he was faking it to begin with. I thought
it does feel like that, doesn't it? Yeah.
At the beginning, at the start of, when she finally was like, here, let me just tell you let me just put it out there now. We're getting a divorce. Like, that's it. I thought he was faking it at the beginning. I thought, oh my gosh, great. He needs to make this about him. He wants to manipulate her into changing her mind, and he's faking this attack. So the fact that he actually died caught me off guard, because I thought he was pretending to be manipulative.
And then she's weeping, of course, and I think that it's very telling that the camera pans over to the window where it's snowing outside, which felt to me like, I guess, to mark sort of a season changing, or something like the dynamic is evolving into something else.
But remember the line that he said? Remember that line of poetry that he first said to her about winter or something and snow falling?
Oh, yeah.
It comes back to that, because he also read that to the photographer, the young photographer from earlier on that he was, hitting on, or whatever that was. That was his line. That was his shtick. Like, oh, I'm going to read this beautiful line of poetry, and I can't remember what it was, but it was about snowfall or something.
Well, like there's not only that, he gets ready to like autograph a walnut for her, just like exactly. Joan finds one of those in his wife's drawer early on, young Joan. So that's, I guess, his move. He's got this one line of poetry.
That's his move.
And his walnut, he's like autographs for them. He's like, here you go.
Yeah. And the move was about, the line was about snow. I can't remember it now, but it was about snow falling and weather. So when they showed that, I thought, here we go. It's like this poetic, weird reminder of it's actually snowing outside. But the line in the poetry that he always said, which wasn't his, because I remember, especially when that young photographer was like, oh, did you write that? He's like, no, it was by someone else or whatever.
James Joyce, I think he mentions.
Yes, I think that's right. was about that, and to show that window in the snow, immediately I thought about the poem. So, I thought that was a really interesting point about the poetry, and now it's actually snowing outside, and here she is, here's Joan standing there.
Yeah, that's a good callback. I didn't catch that.
Yeah. So I thought that was, again, beautifully done, the way that they did that, the meaning behind that, because it was such a pivotal. It's the line that made her swoon, right? It was the line that made this young photographer swoon. It was his thing. And for that to kind of cumulate into this real life moment of that, I thought was, again, just really brilliantly done. But when he actually died, I thought, oh, wow, he really couldn't handle it. The truth would have killed him, literally, in retrospect. Like, had this come out earlier, had Christian Slater's character blown the cap on this whole thing, it would have killed him.
And then Christian Slater, Nathaniel Bone, comes over on the flight back. And there's a really sweet moment, I think, with the flight attendant where she's saying, "Oh, I don't know if you remember me, but I took care of you on the flight over." And she says, "Oh, I could tell you guys really had something special." And Glenn Close is like, "How could you tell?" And he's like, "Oh, just the way you were with each other." And so I guess that speaks to how well they've gotten of keeping up appearances of the fact that everything was so buried deep down over the years that they've spent together. So Nathaniel Bone comes over and she threatens to sue him if he reveals anything about Joe being a fraud, about her writing the books or anything, even if he implies that she's gonna take him to court. Which so even in the midst of everything that's happened and her not being able to take it and walking out on him, when her husband passes away, she ultimately decides to publicly keep his legacy intact, even though David is overheard, and she says that when she gets back, they're going to sit down, him and his sister, and she's going to tell them everything. So what was your reaction? This is that big divisive moment that we were mentioning earlier. What was your reaction to that initially, and then kind of since then?
I was angry.
Well, fair. It's a fair reaction.
That was my first reaction. I'm sitting here thinking she's free in so many. She's free. She can put the truth out there now, but she chose to protect his legacy. And at first, and I'm sitting there on the plane so bad, just really, really upset. Because I thought, okay, it's she didn't kill him. She has nothing to feel badly about in terms. There's no guilt there, right? Even though I think that probably she didn't kill him, but the conversation killed him. Mm-hmm. The news of her wanting to get divorced was too much for him to handle. The fact that I can't help but think what would have happened if he didn't die and they did get the divorce and they're both still alive. And what would have happened? Would she still tell the kids the truth, even though they're divorced? Would the divorce ultimately not physically kill him, but kill the part of him that made him so blind and ridiculous to the whole situation? Would it be? I can't help but think, if he would not have died, would she have finally gotten the credit she deserved? Yeah,
would she have gone through with it, or somehow been like, well, maybe we can patch this up and move on? Because who knows how many times in the past she hasn't gotten maybe quite to this level, but she's clearly has throughout the movie shows her bitterness and shows her how she's upset with him, and he's always like, what the heck, what's wrong with you? Let's just enjoy this. And watching it, not knowing the truth, you're just like, okay, what's up with her? She's in a bad mood, something's on her mind, and we don't know what that is until later on, and you understand how hard it is for her to see her husband get recognized for her work. So yeah, I think that's the intention of the scene, is to us to wonder, well, how would she have handled things differently? Is she, do we understand or at least accept her decision to protect her husband's legacy. Is she feel maybe at this point, what purpose does that serve other than upending this, the body of work that her husband has they worked on together? Like maybe she feels like at this point there's nothing to gain from it. At least publicly, she has the silver lining of at least deciding that she's going to be honest with her kids and let them know what's going on, and probably explain a lot of awkward things in their childhoods. And to me that ending, it really makes a powerful point about how much suffering a wife really endures for the good of her family, and how they really are, in a lot of cases, the stronger one, or really the only strong one, kind of holding the family together. I think in a lot of marriages, that kind of tends to be the dynamic, especially for relationships that started in the 50s and 60s. Like the husband went to work and the wife, basically held everything down. And I think that this film really highlights that in a way that it's both a commentary on and sort of in contrast to everything we see going on now, like with the Me Too movement. Like I feel like in a way it's very relevant to everything that's happening in the last few years.
I agree with you on that. And I think that had he not died, I think Nathaniel probably would have discovered the truth anyway. I think he already knew the truth, right? He already knew, just he needed the evidence to kind of back that up. And I think he would have eventually found it. But I agree with you that there's, I think, my first reaction was I was just angry. I'm like, really, girl? You can this is your moment. Get your credit. And so I was frustrated. So many years, so many decades she put up with all this stuff. And now this was an opportunity for her to step out of this shadow and this lie that she's been living under and speak her truth finally. But that was my initial reaction. And I spent the rest of the flight and many days after, and in some ways still till this day, thinking about why she decided to just let that be, just let that stand, let his legacy live. And I think part of that is she, knowing what I know of her and this kind of blank page, right? There was that symbolism around the blank page. Yep. That she's gonna take this on. Because I think even if she did say, okay, you know what, this whole time it's been me, now that he's gone, she still has to prove herself, right? Okay, now he's gone now, so go ahead, write something amazing. Prove that you were actually the voice behind all of this. Because he's not there to defend that. He's not there to kind of counteract what she's saying, so she has no choice but to prove it. If you've been the writer of all of these great things all along, then go ahead, write something else amazing. Because either if you don't, then we know that all this time that Joe is Joe, the true Nobel Prize winner. But if you can prove yourself as being the actual person by writing incredible things, then okay, fine, we'll believe you. But I think there's a part of her that says, either way, I have to prove myself. Either way, I have to show that, yes, I actually, not only did I write those things, but I can prove that I wrote those things because here's my next body of work that's going to be equally amazing. And so either way, she has to prove herself. So now I think it came down to, does destroying his legacy, is that going to really, she still has to prove herself either way. So why not just at least keep his legacy intact, at least for the benefit of the children, or for whatever the reason is, right? It's a very unselfish thing to do, I think. Or maybe it's selfish, I don't know. But I can understand now why she decided to keep his legacy intact. Because either way, she has to prove herself. Either way, she needs to define herself now. And I have no doubt that she will, right? If this movie continued for another hour, I'm sure that her next thing would be a New York Times bestseller, and she will find her way. And then her children, I guess, can benefit from having two amazing writing parents, as is perceived. So I a part of me still struggles a little bit, to be honest, but I think that I can also understand why she would just say, you know what, that's the past. Let him keep his legacy. I at the end of the day, kind of sort of killed him, right? And so at least I owe him this. I did my wanting to divorce him, killed him. At least let him have this.
I think it's that sense of closure that, like you said, what really, sure, maybe she has, drafts and handwriting things that they could probably match up and decipher that she really wrote these things. But it's also like, at this point, I think she just wanted out of her current situation. She wanted a sense of closure. Before, her only way out was to leave him. And now that's already done. So it's just like, why put her and her family through that whole, as you said, the whole process, and like when she could just get a clean slate and literally a blank page to move from now, and just close that literal book on their marriage and that sort of facade that they had going on.
Right. And I think for David too, if you think about what's ahead for him and his writing future.
Right.
And now that he's going to know the truth, and he's going to have the real person he should have been worshiping all along at his side, giving him the guidance, in many ways you kind of create this, dynasty of just great writers and families without having to tarnish, without having, you get this fresh start on a positive footing, right? Like, okay, yes, we are a family of Nobel Prize winning writers, without having to, you can kind of start off on that foot instead of starting off from the foot of this lie that's been around for decades, and not having to deal with the unraveling of all of that and having to go. Because I also think in many ways, had she said the truth, had she let Nathaniel write the truth, she would probably spend many years going, unraveling everything, right? Like having to now go backwards in time and relive all of that, mm-hmm. and have the children relive all of that. Because it would happen, right? The Nobel Prize in literature, that person, it's a big deal. It's in the history books now.
Yeah.
And now you have this next generation, for David, their firstborn, to have to relive through the unraveling of this lie. And then I think it also casts doubt on the family too, perhaps in the future. Like, okay, well, how do we know that he's really writing all this stuff? Or how do we know? So I really finally came to terms with understanding and even, rethinking my initial reaction of, this is actually a very smart move on her part. Because now she doesn't have to go backwards now. Mm-hmm. She can just go forward. She knows what she knows. The family's going to know what they know. And she obviously will just kill it, right? She's going to be amazing. Nathaniel can write her book review, whatever. So I kind of think now that it was actually a pretty smart choice, thinking long term.
Yeah, and she has a new grandchild now, and it's just
right.
And in a lot of ways, it gives her the, not in necessarily the way she wanted, because her husband's now passed away, which is not what she was really intending. But it gives her the fresh start that she's needed, that she's been yearning for all these years to finally stand on her own and step out of the shadow of her husband and actually not be the support of the wife, as the title says, and be her own person, be a woman who stands alone and speaks up for herself.
Exactly. And that look on her face at the end was just brilliant, because again, there's that subtle determination of, all right, I'm ready to rock and roll. And she was just so brilliant at these facial expressions of understanding what's just beneath the surface, right? There's the facial expression, and then there's just what's beneath the surface. And to me, and that kind of blank page symbolism of, here we go, like I'm ready to rock this out. The sassy woman we saw earlier on with, Nathaniel, and now, she's this woman on this mission kind of. So I would if there was a sequel to this movie, I would absolutely see what happened. There's the two children, the grandchild. You have these three children in the picture. This new generation. You have, her, this blank page, new chapter in front of her. So
coming soon, The Woman, starring Glenn Close.
The Woman. Yes. Yes, that would be amazing. The divorcee, the widow.
Exactly.
Yeah, any of those titles would be great. I would absolutely watch it, and I think it was, for that reason, I just thought it was such a great film, and it's not a film of, these films that tell these stories that so many of us can relate to, right? As a woman, as a wife, not as a wife, but as a woman, I'm also a writer, as looking at the son and this dynamics with the father. All of these characters are, I think there's something that the audience can find themselves in some of these different characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'll relate to somebody in this.
Right.
So did you have any other final thoughts on the film before we close it out?
I think if someone hasn't seen the film, I highly recommend that they watch it, and that they themselves can add maybe some new perspectives to the broader dialogue of this film.
Yeah, and I think that's what surprised me when I first watched it is, I went in expecting a really powerful Glenn Close performance, which I got, but I didn't expect it to have this much to really dig into. That I'm a writer also, obviously, so I anything about the creative process, things like that, I find really engaging to begin with. Plus, I've been in a relationship, obviously, so all that stuff. Like, there's a lot. I'm a son, so there's multiple dynamics that you understand where everybody's coming from, and there's many different entry points for someone to connect to the story, and as you said, question, well, what would I do in that situation, or how much would I put up with? Like, do we understand why she's handling things the way she's handling things? So it's unfortunate in a way that Glenn Close didn't get the Oscar for this, but I've been hearing more and more. I know she's going to be in a remake of Sunset Boulevard that I think is coming out this year or next. I'm not sure exactly, but I have a feeling it's going to be one of those classic Oscar situations where someone lost for an award that everybody thought they were going to get, and so the next year they finally rectify that decision. I think I remember like 20 years ago, Russell Crowe was everybody was thinking was going to win for The Insider, and he didn't get that, and he got for Gladiator instead. Or Denzel Washington was very much thought to a favorite to get it for The Hurricane, and instead he got it for Training Day the next year. And a lot of people were saying, oh, well, Training Day is a great performance, but it's also kind of buoyed by the fact that he kind of should have almost won for The Hurricane the previous year. So I feel like it's going to be that kind of situation with Glenn Close, and that she'll probably get that Oscar finally for Sunset Boulevard next year. So we'll see. That'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
I think it's only, it's been a long time coming, but I think it's on the horizon for her, and I'm sure that whatever she does next, it's going to be great. I literally watch, there's certain movies I watch just because people are in it. I don't even need to know what the plot is. I just like, oh, that person's in it. I'm done. Like, so she's the same. I will watch whatever she's in forever and ever. And it's true also, for the other actors in the film. I just, I think they all did a wonderful, great job. So let's see what happens. My fingers are crossed for Glenn. I think, she'll get it.
Yeah, I think so too. So, Angela, thank you so much for being on the Crooked Table podcast. Can you tell people where they can find you on social media?
Absolutely. I am on Instagram at Angie B Travels. So please follow me on my random adventures around the world in my travels, and all over the United States. So I look forward to seeing you on there. And I'm also going to be relaunching my my kind of lifestyle blog and also podcast very, very soon. And I will be posting about those on my Instagram. So follow me on Instagram at Angie B Travels to keep up with the things that are coming in soon.
Great. Well, I'll be sure to link to that on the show post for this on crookedtable.com. Again, thanks so much for coming on. And I think this was a really good film to talk about. It gave me a chance to go back and revisit it after a few months with fresh eyes. So yeah, thanks so much. I think this was a terrific conversation. And definitely when you come across something else you want to talk about, let me know. We'd love to have you back.
Oh my gosh, I would love to be back. Your podcast is awesome. I'm going to also share this broadly. I'm on Facebook and all these other things. So I'm also going to share it across my channels. And thank you so much for having me. It's been so wonderful.
Same here. Likewise. Thanks so much, Angela.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you're interested in joining me on the show to chat about one of your favorite films, head on over to crookedtable.com/guest. Or you can consider supporting the show at patreon.com/crookedtable. Of course, you can always find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. Until next time, this has been the Crooked Table Podcast, and I've been Rob.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
CROOKED.